welcome to episode 143 of the Weekly podcast. Thanks for joining us, as always, wherever you do on YouTube or the podcast platforms. And thanks for your support during the week. Thank you so much to Fiona Scarlett for coming on last week to talk about her book, Boys Don't Cry, creativity and the difficulties that people have in accepting acclaim or credit or things like that. And I honestly think we always, every time I talk about this kind of thing, I say it's an Irish thing, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's a more universal. But the Irish are particularly good at deflecting away from any sort of, pat on the back that they might receive. But Fiona, you were great, so thanks a lot. We're going to get into this week. It's our third annual Halloween episode, which I'm really excited about. We are joined by Halloween expert and six-time Bram Stoker award winner Lisa Morton. How are you doing, Lisa?
I'm doing great, Derek. Thanks.
Thank you very much for joining us. I was just saying to before we started recording, it's a very I really like this time of the year. I'm one of the people that like to indulge in some horror films around the beginning of October. And before we kind of get into the questions that we always ask, was this always a big thing for you, Halloween?
Yeah, I think so. When I was a kid growing up, I'm a native Los Angelino, and so I don't quite have all of the seasonal associations with Halloween that you probably do, but it was a big deal here in my little suburb where I grew up in LA, and trick or treat was such a magical night. It was so cool to be able to, and back then we went trick or treating without our parents, which is something that doesn't happen now. And I feel sorry for kids missing that experience now, because it was like the one night when you were empowered, you got to go out by yourself and you were dressed as something you loved. And so, yeah, I always loved it for sure.
We went trick-or-treating as well, and it was obviously without our parents too, and it was something very freeing and fun, and something kind of, you could feel the kind of, that kind of little bit of what's the word I'm kind of looking for? There was something in the air that was quite different about Halloween, and the change of the seasons is a big thing, because obviously over here around this, it's actually quite mild at the moment, but normally it's you can put it into whether you're from the city or the country, out in the rural areas. And in the rural areas, it'd be kind of the turf fires that would have started around October, and it's getting a bit colder. You got your heavy jacket on. I will say that every Irish young person of my age wore a black refuse sack at one point as a costume, because it was cheap and you could wrap it around you and put some tape, and you were a witch then, But it was a lot of fun. And I mentioned to you about the difference there. The Irish seem to be catching up the Americans with regards to decorations and things like that, because I know from myself seeing a lot of American films and horror films, it is it's a bigger kind of festival over there.
Yeah, it's an interesting history in regards to Ireland, because it's kind of like it came from the Irish. They exported it to us. We completely recreated it here in America and then sent it back to you.
It's which is quite nice. We're kind of, like I say, it is it's a really wonderful, mischievous is probably the word I was looking for, mischievous time of year, and I'm all for it. But Lisa, could you give us a short history of your upbringing, please?
Yeah, I grew up here in LA. I always describe myself as that weird little girl who wanted to be a monster instead of a princess at Halloween. When I was 15, my mother actually took me to see The Exorcist in a theater, and completely changed my life in 2 hours, because by the time I left the theater, I knew I had to be a writer. And I have pursued that pretty much since. I started actually as a screenwriter, and I wrote some really bad movies that are the kind of things that show up on like the Sci-Fi Channel at 4 a.m. And I realized at some point that movies were not everything I had thought they would be. And so at that point, I moved into fiction writing and kind of found my home there. And I've been writing fiction and nonfiction for about 30 years now.
The Exorcist is one of those films. Now, obviously, I think I saw it when I was maybe around 16 or 17, so around the same age. But it certainly is one of those films that it stands the test of time. And I'm not like, obviously I know why, because it is a brilliantly made film and all the rest. But What I really like about The Exorcist and films made around that time is the practical effects of the
Yeah.
film. I think, I don't know if you'd agree, but I think that they definitely add a lot more depth to the horror than what we see now with CGI and stuff.
Yeah, I agree 1,000%. And in fact, they did that later release of The Exorcist where Friedkin went in and added a few simple
Mm.
CGI things, and I hate that version. I absolutely think the practical effects make the horror in that movie much more visceral.
Um, when did you first become aware of mental health?
You know, I don't know. It's one of those things that I was very lucky that we didn't have a lot of that going on in our family. I had one uncle who had, it's one of those things where as a kid they just all kind of say, oh no, it's Uncle Ernie. And then,
Hmm.
when you're an adult, you look back and you go, God, Uncle Ernie had undiagnosed depression,
Yeah.
and it kind of just pushed him off into a corner. And I feel badly for him now, although of course he's long gone. But um, other than that, I was very lucky in so many regards. I was a tremendously privileged kid, I think. um, Growing up, middle class American. I was an only child, so I didn't even have to. And my parents, neither one of them were close to their families. We were just kind of this group of three out in this LA suburb.
Okay, so yeah, well, that's pretty nice. I mean, like I always say on this podcast that there's a huge difference in answers to that question, and it's wonderful to hear the different responses that we get from it, because it is all dependent on the environments and things we grew up in and things like that, and it's so important. But so obviously you started, like you say, in screenwriting, but when you began writing in fiction, was it always in you with this idea and love for Halloween that you would go to nonfiction at some point?
It was not.
Okay.
Yeah, that was kind of a surprise to me too, I think, because I started, my real favorite form is short stories. I love
Mm.
writing short stories. And I wrote short stories throughout the 90s, and I was managing to sell them and publish them in some pretty good books and magazines and so forth. And then what happened was at some point in the late 90s, I became obsessed with the work of a Chinese filmmaker named Choi Hawk,
Okay.
who worked out of Hong Kong. And his magnificent films often featured women, very, very strong women, and these amazing actresses. And I just loved them. And they were screening a lot here in the LA area at the time. So it was easy to, excuse me, to go see them in theaters or to get bootleg copies of them or whatever. And I actually put together a little primitive website about how much I enjoyed his films. And at some point, somebody said something about you should do this as a book. And I ended up getting in contact with him.
Oh.
And his wife, who was also a gigantic figure in the Hong Kong film industry, said to me, why don't you come over here and spend a week with us? Which of course was mind blowing. And I did that. And so I interviewed him for a week and managed to put a book together out of that. And that actually was my first full length book. And so after that, I realized, nonfiction is really fun. And the publisher that I did that book with said to me after we finished it, do you want to do another book? And I looked at some things they had brought out recently, and they had just published a book called The Christmas Encyclopedia.
Hmm.
So I went back to them and said, hey, nobody's ever done a Halloween encyclopedia. That might be fun. And they went for that, and that sort of started my obsession with Halloween. I mean, I always loved the holiday, but it wasn't a big thing for me until I wrote that first book. And when you write an encyclopedia on something, you tend to both gather a tremendous amount of material that you can roll over into other books and become pretty much obsessed with it, which I still am. The encyclopedia came out about 20 years ago, and there have been two other nonfiction books on Halloween since then, and also an updated edition of the encyclopedia.
When you were learning about Halloween, and how does it change? Because we've spoken a little bit about America and Ireland. How much does it change through the different countries?
It's very interesting. Halloween, when I wrote the encyclopedia, Halloween was still almost strictly confined to America and parts of the UK.
Hmm.
it was not a huge worldwide thing at all. And that has just happened within the last 15 years and has been astonishing to watch unfold. And it changes when it gets moved to other regions and other countries and so forth in some interesting ways, and in other ways it doesn't change at all. I mean, it seems like everybody loves the idea of costume kids who go out and trick or treat. That's beloved all over the world. Big grinning orange pumpkins, everyone loves. One of the interesting things that you see in pockets of Europe is that they were already celebrating All Saints Day on November 1st. And that's a very solemn observance where you go out to a graveyard and you clean and decorate the graves and the tombstones and so forth. And a lot of places they liked Halloween. They didn't want to lose that. So there are many areas of Europe that are now celebrating both. They go out on the 31st, they have Halloween, and then the next day they're doing the very somber celebration of All Saints Day. So that's kind of interesting. And then, of course, if you look at what happens in Mexico, that's one of the most interesting spots because Mexico had a sort of similar history to Ireland, where way back, you have these Catholic missionaries who are coming in to convert the indigenous peoples. Of course, in Ireland, it was the ancient Celts, and in Mexico, it was peoples like the Aztecs and Mayans who were there. And you get a very different holiday when you get the Catholics coming in on top of these different things. So with the coming into Ireland and taking over Samhain, trying to co-opt Samhain from the Celts, we get that sort of macabre thing that eventually becomes Halloween. But with Dia de los Muertos down in Mexico, we get this thing that is both a sort of honoring of your deceased loved ones and a very playful poke at death. Death is mocked and taunted in Dia de los Muertos. And we're seeing that holiday, which has its very own character, getting exported to areas now. Here in America, it has really begun to catch on. For example, this year, a major candy company like Seed Candy is marketing the heck out of Dia de los Muertos. So it's interesting. I'm looking forward to following its progress in a lot of Asian areas. For example, in Hong Kong, it's been pretty big there for about 20 years now, but there's a big amusement park there that does its own themed Halloween haunts and mazes and so forth. And they actually have done some that incorporated Chinese mythology. And that's something I find very interesting. And I wonder if we're going to see that, more of that kind of incorporating local folklore and mythology as it continues to spread, rather.
When we talk about things like folklore, and I know you've written a book about ghosts, and I was listening to something, this is just a complete coincidence this morning that I was listening to a podcast, and they talked about in Japan, for instance, the idea of believing in ghosts is a lot more accepted than it might be in some other countries. And I found out that the Japanese Prime Minister in 2013, I think it was, he decided not to move back into the mansion that he was provided because he believed it was haunted. And it was fine. Like, everybody thought, well, that's grand if it's haunted, like you shouldn't live there. But I think that if it was in Ireland or England or America, there might immediately be a bit of like, what are you talking about?
I think that was true, maybe at least here in America. That might have been true 15 or 20 years ago. It's not so much anymore. And part of it is due to that explosion of interest in paranormal reality television series, which have brought home the idea that anyone can go ghost hunting now, and belief in the paranormal has certainly risen tremendously since then. My house, we bought our house 7 years ago, and when we bought the house, our paperwork actually had an entire section dedicated to, we verify that the house is not haunted.
Really?
Which was astonishing to me that was incorporated into these legalese documents. You know, every other word was something you had to look up, and then stuck in the middle of it is this section of, oh, your house is not haunted.
And like, so for you then, is the, with regard to ghosts, are you fully a full believer in that they exist?
I'm not actually. I'm
Okay.
very skeptical.
Yeah.
And in fact, we used to laugh at the reviews I would get for Ghost of Haunted History. Our favorite one came from, I think, something like The Guardian, and referred to my puckish skepticism. I try to be a very open-minded
Hmm.
skeptic. I have friends who are mediums, and I absolutely do not discount their experience or what they do at all. I absolutely believe they are experiencing something. I
Hmm.
walked into rooms with them where they will suddenly stop and say, "Oh, something bad happened right here." And what's strange is they're almost always right. Whoever owns this building or house will walk up and say, "Oh, yes, that's right where such and such happened." I have no idea what's going on. I don't necessarily believe they are in communication with the spirits of dead people. I think it's entirely possible that they are wired differently in some other way, that they are picking up on even something like electromagnetic radiation.
Hmm.
That's something else, is that I have been next to friends who we would be seated in the same room doing a paranormal investigation, and my friend next to me says something's touching me. And I have no doubt that he absolutely felt that. I don't know what was going on in his head that made him feel that, but I absolutely believe he felt that he was being touched. So I try not to be. I'm not a fan of the skeptics who are like, "Oh, it's all
Hmm.
hallucinating, it's all pretend," because I do believe something's going on. I have no idea what.
Yeah, I think for me it's been about, and this may be a bit of a silly attitude to have, but I think that I haven't seen any, so I can't quite believe in them. I guess is probably the way I'd put it. I do, like you mentioned the thing about ghost hunters on TV, and so would you say in that way it's just pure dramatization for ratings and figures, or do you think that the people who do the ghost hunting truly believe, and they feel the same as maybe your friends are feeling?
I think most of them truly believe. I
Hmm.
have no doubt that a few are a little bit on the fraudulent side. I also have no doubt that whatever they are recording at these places they go to is probably pumped up in post production. Oh, look, the light on that screen is very bright, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I actually have talked to a few of the people who are sort of the paranormal stars, and they believe it.
Mm.
They definitely believe what's going on.
Yeah, which is fine. I mean, it's not like they're making you watch it and making you believe what they're seeing and feeling. But Lisa, give me 1 second. I have to read out an advert. You know the way things are these days, and we'll get back into it. All right. Okay, Fusion Training Center, Monksland Athlone, a place to train in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, kickboxing, martial arts, and CrossFit. A great atmosphere with experienced coaches and a real sense of community. If you want to join the team, find us on Facebook at Fusion Training Center or drop in for a chat. Fusion Training Center, train like a warrior. So, like I told you, I had the pleasure of reading your book, A History of Seances, Calling Spirits, sorry, A History of Seances. And I think that, I didn't know how far this went back because, you know, through a lack of knowledge, and I guess just knowing from films, I thought it started maybe in the 30s or 40s. It goes back, back all the way. But you know, I think, can you tell us maybe a little bit about like how the early necromancy was happening in Roman times, or for the Celts?
Yeah, if we look especially, I mean, we have some pretty good historical recordings from the Greeks and the Romans. We don't have much from the Celts. What we have on them is what the Catholic missionaries
Mhm.
recorded, and it's probably some of it's probably fairly accurate. So we do know that the Celts told ghost stories, and the Celts believed in an other world, and they thought that things would cross over from that other world from time to time, usually on Samhain, which of course
Mhm.
was the forerunner to Halloween. I've never heard of the Celts necessarily being able to, at least the ancient Celts, being able to call down the spirits or has summon them. That was something that was very popular, though, in the Greek and Roman tradition. For example, with the Greeks, we have Homer's The Odyssey, in which Odysseus and his men are stuck and they're trying to find their way home, and they're thinking, oh, if we could just talk to the dead prophet Tiresias, we could find our way home. And so the sorceress Circe tells them how to do it, and it's very complicated. They have to sail to this particular area. They have to sacrifice a black ram. They have to drain its blood and wine into a trench and dip their sword into it and so forth. What's interesting about that scene is that they end up calling up all kinds of spirits. They don't seem to have a lot of control over it. It takes them forever to get to Tiresias. Before they get to him, Odysseus encounters his mother, who he didn't even know was dead. And so with the Roman and Greek traditions, there are a lot of recordings of how you would communicate with the dead. Sometimes they outline a very complicated ritual like that. Other times it was something as simple as you might go to see a seer who would, like an oracle, who would say to you, oh, if you want to talk to the spirit, you need to go to their graveyard and sleep on the tomb. That was one way they would do it. They believed that spirits would visit you in dreams. Again, we have an example of that in the Iliad, when the spirit of Patroclus comes to his friend Achilles in a dream and tells him, I didn't receive a proper burial, so I'm haunting you. And then as you move into the Middle Ages is when you start to get into some of the really crazy necromancy stuff, which again makes the ritual that Odysseus had to engage in look easy. I mean, this stuff is crazy by the time you get into the necromancers of the Middle Ages and the great grimoires, the spell books that they were using. And one of the interesting things throughout all of this is that you look at it and it's always a solitary activity. It's always either the lone magician who is standing at the crossroads trying to summon the spirit, or it's the going out to the graveyard to sleep by yourself on the tombstone. It's not until we get to the seance in 1848 that you suddenly get this idea that calling spirits is a group activity. It's something you do with friends, and it's actually kind of fun even. That was something that was just absolutely revolutionary.
The Fox sisters, which are a big part in the book from, like you mentioned, 1848, and it was referred to as table rappings, you know, at the time. But I try to, you know, it's very hard to think like with all what we know now, is thinking the way that the people might have been thinking at the time. But I can't imagine how incredible it was to believe. Obviously there's going to be skeptics as well, but if you were there in the room and seeing this kind of thing happening and the table wrappings and stuff, I can't imagine how freaky that must be.
It was freaky, I'm sure, especially, I mean, in the beginning of the whole thing, which was also the birth of the spiritualist movement. Certainly no one had ever seen anything like that. And then as the movement advances through the late 19th century, you start to get this idea that almost anyone can be a medium, but there are people who are more skilled at it than others, and they become the superstars. And one of the fun things about writing that book was discovering these amazing stories of these people who became the star mediums, and all the scandals and things that were involved around them, and how often they were debunked, and yet their followers just kept saying, oh, no, they're real. That putting aside what we would think of as putting aside logic and common sense to persist in a belief was really fascinating to me.
There's kind of a thing about it these days, if you know, if it's whether it's seances or even, you know, fortune telling and stuff. There seems to be kind of a split between it's something like a fun exploit, you know, to get, you know, thing that we like to do, or it's still seen as quite a serious business for other people.
Yeah. In fact, I often say that I think spiritualism split off to become two different forks in the 21st century. I mean, started in the 20th, but I think on the one hand, it has become that modern psychic, the superstar psychics who will go to an auditorium and hundreds of people buy a ticket to hear them say, oh, your Aunt Jean is here with us. And then on the other hand, because spiritualism definitely had its scientific side. It actually, in the beginning, believed it was the only religion that could be proven scientifically. And a lot of prominent scientists were believers and were involved with the movement early on. That has become our modern paranormal investigation, that obsession with the idea that scientific devices like EMF meters can reveal the presence of spirits. And so yeah, and it's interesting that the belief in that now is, if anything, stronger in some ways than what we saw with the early spiritualists.
Yeah, there's you can, anybody and most people will have probably gone onto YouTube and seen some clips of kind of amateur ghost hunters and things online. And look, the thing is, I've gone onto them as well, and I've wondered, like, was that, what they were thinking it was? And that's, that's kind of fine. I think another thing that people have all kind of had a go at is a Ouija board. Have you tried a Ouija board before? I'm guessing you have.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I was part of that generation, and I think kids still do it, where if you were growing up and you went to a slumber party with your friends, at some point a Ouija board was brought out.
Yeah. Has anything ever happened?
Not with a Ouija board.
Right.
I have also done some paranormal investigations in which a few odd things happened. I manage, since I live in the West Coast, I'm fairly close to some really famous locations. I've done a search throughout the Queen Mary, for example, and
Right.
the Stanley Hotel in Colorado is very famous for being haunted. And I did have something happen there that was like, okay, that was weird. I'm not sure how I can explain that. We were actually out in an outbuilding there that's a concert hall, and it was like 3 a.m, and it was October, and it was very cold, and the wind was whistling, and the setting is perfect in the first place, and the building is very dark, and we were using a device called a spirit box. I don't know if you know what that is,
Yeah.
but it's a thing that rapidly scans radio frequencies, and it sounds like just a blur of white noise that is occasionally punctuated with a word. And nothing had been happening for a while, and the spirit box was on, and all of a sudden this word blurted out of this thing that sounded like mostalaria, which, I mean, that threw me for a loop, because at the time I was researching my Ghost to Haunted history book, and I had just studied the history of Roman playwrights, and Plautus wrote a very famous play called The Haunted House. The actual Latin title is Mostalaria.
Oh.
And to hear that come out of this thing at 3 a.m in a Colorado building was genuinely weird. Now, my skeptical answer to that is that it was probably something that sounded like Mostalaria. It was probably a disc jockey somewhere saying, and most of the are,
Yeah.
something. But it's fascinating to me that the human brain wants to make sense out of this.
Yeah, I did one once, and just with the girl I was seeing at the time, and I don't know whose idea it was, but we were doing it with a coin or something, like, but like halfway through, she properly like got really frightened and started, saying, we have to burn this, all the coin, and we have to burn it. And like, obviously for me, I didn't know what she was, after seeing her, how she felt or stuff like that. And it was a while ago now, but it was enough kind of, even though I didn't see or feel anything, enough for me to kind of go, I don't know if I'll bother doing one of those again. I just thought, I've had my go at it, but but so when you're writing novels and short stories, and I know your short stories, like you mentioned, is a big thing. Do the things like, the awards, the Bram Stoker Award, obviously a very famous Irish writer, do they mean a lot to you? Oh,
They do and they don't.
yeah.
I mean, I'm certainly very proud of them. I'm tremendously honored to be a recipient of these awards, but when you are doing the actual writing, of course, you have to immerse yourself in the world of the story. I mean, I think it would be disastrous for any writer to think, oh, I'm going to write a story that's going to win me another award. That way lies madness for me.
That's fair. I think that's fair enough. And so with your writing with regards to the fiction, then are they Do you do some child friendly ones and then you do adult ones as well, or are they predominantly adult?
I've done some YA fiction.
Mm.
I've had a few short stories that were published in things for kids. So yeah, I love the whole YA world, and it's been really interesting to see that explode in popularity over the last 25 years or so. And it's gone in such interesting directions. I often, in fact, wish I could write more
Mm.
YA stuff, and I've considered doing an actual novel, and it's just one more of those things I somehow never get to.
Well, look, we only have so much time at our hands, I suppose. But why do you think we still tell ghost stories? Why do we enjoy being scared?
I think it is a way for us to test ourselves in a very safe environment. It's the same reason that we go to haunted attractions and that we love Halloween, because we, I think we experience something very special when we test ourselves in that way, when we test our fears, and we can end up saying, oh, I survived, I can survive these things. And we, as we are going through, for example, a haunted house, and there are people jumping out at you and there are monsters and things happening, but you know it's safe, provided you're not doing one of the extreme haunted houses, which
Yeah.
I don't think ever do, because I'm not sure they are even the same experience. They're more about endurance than playful testing of your fears.
Yeah. There's a thing over here now. I don't. We probably do have some sort of a, because obviously a lot of castles, and I'm sure they do some sort of a Halloween, a tour within those older castles. But well, they're all old. But there's one in particular. I think it's called Pharmaphobia. But I know they have them in the States as well. They have them in a lot with the cornfields and stuff. That to me is kind of, it's an interesting thing. I'm not sure if I'm ready to jump in yet. Like it's one of those ones. Like I have anxiety, so I don't. I often wonder, would it help with anxiety, or because I've heard people talk about horror films as a really good thing for anxiety and for mental health, because it does take you out of yourself, take you away from that feelings that you may be having. So I often wonder if I should just jump into a cornfield somewhere and just get scared.
Well, my suggestion on that, Derek, would be to watch some YouTube videos of them,
Hmm.
because you can, I mean, people are all filming themselves
Yeah.
going through these things now. And in fact, here in Southern California, where we have so many professional haunts, including the ones that started it all with the amusement parks, there are places that get special permission from the attractions to film them in really beautiful detail. I don't have time during October to go to anything, but I can sit down for a few minutes and watch these videos because I like to keep up to date with what's going on in that big part of Halloween. And that might, I that might be a very good way for you to find out if you think you can do this or not,
Yeah.
because you'll see exactly what they're like. And of course, it won't be quite the full immersive experience, but I mean, if watching the video is making you anxious, maybe you shouldn't.
That's it. That's a good point. And it's funny, I always think of YouTube for everything. I think I need to fix my bike tire. I look on YouTube, but I never thought of that. So thank you very much for that. How does your October look? Because it must be pretty hectic.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I do dozens and dozens of shows and interviews and presentations and lectures, and but we also, since we bought our house 7 years ago, we've always loved yard haunts. So we do our own little tiny yard haunt, which is
Right.
more of an artistic collage of pieces that we like. We turn our driveway into a graveyard, and we make it very family friendly because we love seeing the families who show up every year and will tell us, oh, I liked what you've added this year, and make their kids pose with things. And so that part of it is really fun. We don't do gore or like
Yeah.
big monsters or anything. Yeah.
I like this. I like that. I think the Americans do it particularly well with regards to obviously decoration and stuff. When you see the houses, and I mentioned that Ireland are catching up. There is one house that's not too far from here that's got a huge kind of array of again family friendly but amazingly done lights and figures and witches and stuff done up. And I think that's great. Like it's nice to see. And you know it's a nice, it's just that kind of little celebration in between, maybe that, like the summer when the kids are off, and then this Christmas, which is the big thing. And I just think, to make a little bit more of it is is quite interesting. I was also like like I said, I was out running this morning, and I got to thinking about banshees. Okay, because
Yeah.
again, it's something that I used to hear about when I was young a lot, like from my from maybe from my parents, or there'd be kind of stories that be passed down about like someone heard a banshee and stuff, and I don't really hear. I mean, you're not hanging around in the right circles, but I don't hear that anymore about banshees. Is that like what is your what have you heard and read up about on banshees?
It's funny, I was just talking about banshees the other
Okay.
day because I was saying they seem to me to be the one like monster in Western folklore that hasn't had a good movie yet.
That's true. Yeah.
And I suspect if they did, you would be hearing about them everywhere. They have sort of been lost in all of the media representations of these things. Um,
If
so
there's
yeah,
like sorry to cut across you, but there's actually the only time I hear of banshees is there's a bag of like crisps or chips called banshee bones, and that's the only time I ever hear about them. And they're really nice. They're salt and vinegar.
oh,
That's all I know.
oh, they sound great.
Yeah, they are. They're really nice.
Yeah,
But go on.
it's interesting too because I don't know if you know the origin of that word,
No,
banshee. Do you know where that comes from?
no.
That is it's derived from the ancient Celts because the malicious creatures, which were essentially their version of very nasty fairies that the Celts believed lived in their other world, were called the Sidhe.
Oh,
And ban is actually female. A banshee is a female fairy spirit,
ah,
and so that comes down from the ancient Celts, and so that's been around for millennia now, and it's yeah, it's I'm a horror superstar yet. I think that's ones that someone will grab onto at some point.
yeah. I didn't even think of it, but like that is pretty crazy because I mean, there's horror films about leprechauns. You know what? Like a banshee would seem a more scary idea. The leprechauns, but somehow they managed it. Although the leprechaun's not a really good film, but uh, what is like for you? What are some of your favorite horror films that you'd go back to?
I grew up loving the Universal monsters, so
Mhm.
it's one of my little treats to myself every October is to watch a few of the old classic Universal monster movies, Bride of Frankenstein, and I even love the ones that came later in the series that are like these goofy monster mash things, House
Yeah.
of Dracula, that kind of thing. Um, but in terms of like Halloween films, I absolutely love John Carpenter's Halloween.
Mm.
1978 original is still an amazing film, I think. And more recently, Michael Dougherty's Trick or Treat is a great
Brilliant.
film.
Yeah. I I'm gonna say like people will know on this podcast. Halloween the original is my favorite horror film. I would have it very high up in my all-time films. I think that it was my I think it was my initial introduction to what I thought American Halloween was like with the trick or treating and all the
Right.
kind of stuff that went along with it. It's funny that you mentioned Trick or Treat. I since I discovered it, which would be maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I watch it every year. I think the idea of those legends and those those urban legends, I should say, really, that to do with candy and all that stuff was always I never saw it in a complete film. And when I saw Trick or Treat for the first time, I thought that's like a modern. And I think that there's been a bit of a resurgence. I'm with you on the like the old films like The Wolfman and Dracula and Frankenstein, things like that. But there's been a kind of a resurgence, I think, with horror, and I look at stuff like It Follows, which I thought was a film that was very close to Halloween vibe,
Mhm.
and really lent on it, this like terror in suburbia kind of thing. But things like The Witch, that kind of vibe that they got from it, and I've been kind of fascinated by witches. I read a book about them. It didn't come out. Sorry, it came out there about 4 or 5 years ago, and I wish I remember the name of it as we're talking about it. But it's about just, I think it was just called Witches. But It was nonfiction, and it was obviously the history of witches. And I've been fascinated about the view of them from how they were viewed in the witch trials, which you've mentioned in the book that I read, but up until now, where they're almost celebrated.
Yeah, there's been a really interesting transformation
Yeah.
in the perception of witches. And one of the things that I was commenting on recently is that you almost never now hear the term Wiccan.
Mm,
People who practice the craft have embraced witchcraft. They now very openly and happily refer to themselves as witches. And it's interesting to me also that they are very popular on social media.
yeah.
In fact, I was recently working with a nonfiction publisher of sort of spiritual and metaphysical books, and I had pitched them a book that they passed on, and they said, "We love it, but all we can sell right now is witchcraft books."
Really?
It seems to be something that is exploding in popularity at the moment, and I am not sure what's behind that, but I know a number of witches. They are among my favorite people. They are all incredibly sweet natured and caring people, and in fact they inspired my latest piece of fiction, which just came out on Friday, and it's a novella called Halloween Beyond the Talking Board. And there's a character in it. It's about a mystery, a crime that happened where a child went missing a year ago on Halloween, and her sister's trying to find her. And one of the leading suspects is an elderly woman named Bridget, who people believe is a witch. And of
Right.
course, as the story progresses, you find out, yeah, she is a witch, but she's also a wonderful person who's trying to find this child. And that was kind of my love letter to my friends who are witches, and to let people know that even fiction, I think, needs to start changing in how it portrays witches.
Yeah, it is absolutely a fascinating kind of subject, and that change, and if you can't quite, if you don't not quite know what it's down to, I definitely don't know what it's down to. But I do think that um like social media is a great thing to see and hear people, talking about being witches and stuff. And like I said, from when I was young and, going out trick or treating, and we would be dressed up as witches. And to me at that time, it seemed that all Halloween was based around witches because everybody seemed to dress up as a witch. And now, obviously, it's much more, people are kind of catching on with trends. And I know that Jeffrey Dahmer is apparently the big one this year that people are going to dress up on, and people have different feelings on that, but I do think that whole the idea of when you like my first time of hearing about that witch trials was probably through the Crucible, and kind of not really understanding the play because I was too young. But but when as I went on, I saw the film and I maybe reread it, and I kind of thought that was just like, because I know there was so much panic around and everybody gets on board, and the delusions of crowds and stuff. And then I read about, the 80s and 90s in the States. The satanic panic was another thing that kind of came along. And like, I'm hoping that this kind of thing doesn't rear its ugly head again, that, they'll latch onto something like that. But how interesting was that actually for you? Because you would have been obviously in the States, something like the satanic panic, and, it was bizarre.
It was bizarre, and I remember reading about it even then and thinking, this is
Yeah.
nonsense. I mean, it seemed to me that anyone with a brain should have looked at it and said, well, you have no evidence of any of this actually happening.
Yeah.
What are you doing? And yet even I think the FBI was embracing it at some point. And I mean, it tied right into using psychics to
Mm.
find crimes, which again, it was the kind of thing that you would read and you would think, but they've never done it. Why are you doing this? Yeah, and I was actually very interested in a famous trial here called the West Memphis
Oh yeah.
Three,
Yeah.
which is, yeah, the marvelous documentary Paradise Lost came out of that case. And that was a satanic panic thing that led to the false incarceration of three young men. So yeah, it definitely was both nonsensical and kind of terrifying for the
Yeah.
wrong reasons.
I think the FBI made some sort of a a training. I heard it on a podcast or something, but it was like a trainer video for other FBI agents to spot this satanic panic, and it was absolute nonsense. The stuff that they had in the video and in the the recording. And yeah, I was another one that watched Paradise Lost, and it's a great piece of documentary filmmaking, but young lads who listened to Metallica and maybe drew some symbols on a copy, and then they got 18 years in prison for it, and still are seen as guilty because they had to sign off a certain law to say that they had, they were guilty, but they'd served their time. And yeah, it's the whole thing, the way that the crowd can move, and it can build and build and become this kind of outrageous kind of thing. But so you've just released, like you said, a new novella. Is it like for the writing process for you? Is it everyday thing? Is it when the magic strikes, or how do you do it?
Well, when you reach my level, it's like, this is going to sound like horrible bragging, but when you hit a certain level, let's say in your career, if you are maintaining a day job as well or have another job, I love my day job. I'm a bookseller, and I have done that my whole life. And it's one of those things where I almost refuse to give it up as long as I can. But there are only so many hours in the day. So I am not someone who believes in that ironclad, oh, you have to write X number of words every day, because there are days when my writing time goes entirely to the non-writing part of writing, which is the contracts and the research and the interviews and the maintaining your social media presence, which now has to be part of your career.
Mm-hmm.
And since COVID hit, it's become even harder for me because my work hours shifted.
Okay.
And they now have sort of cut into the time I used to use to write every day. And I still haven't readjusted yet, even though it's now been 2 years. And so for me, my writing the actual writing part of writing tends to get accomplished on my days off. And when that happens, I'm experienced enough at it by now that I can churn out things fairly quickly. Although there are also some bizarre assignments. Like right now, my big project for this year has been my first coffee table art book, which is really fun. It will be released in fall of 2023. It's called The Art of the Zombie Movie. It's really fun. It's been really fun to put together, but I have discovered that doing a coffee table art book is completely different from anything else. And we are far enough along in the process now that they have like a team of an army of people working on this book, and the layout artists are now working through their passes and laying out all of the images and so forth. And my next task is to go in and write the captions, which sounds like something that you'd be like, well, big deal, except my contract specifies 27,000 words of captions.
Oh.
I have to caption right now, the book has 512 images. And the captions in these books have a certain style, which is that they kind of add to the text. So you are not just reiterating the same information that's in the text. You might be saying, oh, in this particular role, Bela Lugosi's inspiration was blah, blah, blah. So the captions become almost a secondary text in these books. And that's what I'm working on right now. So it's a weird job because you're writing little tiny 50-word chunks.
It sounds like a must-have, to be honest with you. It sounds silly. And I mean, the way people like really seem to revere zombie films as well. Like there's such a huge and there's quite a lot of really great zombie films too, which makes it even better, so this is a question I ask everyone. What do you like to do in your spare time?
I love gardening. Although the climate change here in LA has rendered some of that null and void. Our summers now are so long and so hot that things I used to grow even 5 years ago, I can't grow anymore. But I still love it. I do plant a lot of now succulents and natives, and I have cats. I think one just wandered through the background that I love. But and I love being a part of the writing community. So I love like trying to mentor new writers. And I've done a lot of work with the Horror Writers Association, which is the biggest organization in the world for horror writers. And I find that really fulfilling. Just helping other writers is a big thing for me.
That's brilliant. And where can people find you in social media?
Probably start with my website, lisamorton.com, and then right from there, you'll see links to my Facebook and Instagram.
Excellent. I will make sure I post that when I put this episode out. I'll post that. Lisa, you've been a terrific guest, as I knew you would.
Thank you very much, Derek. This has been great fun.
Thanks a lot. Listen, would you mind just staying there for 1 minute? I'll finish this out. I'll take one photo from my collection, my ever-growing collection, and then we'll be on our way. Is that okay?
That sounds great.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lisa. I also need to thank John Francis for doing all the tech work that I'm unable to do. And thank my mum, my dad, my granddad, as always, and also Jer and Calvin for their help in the podcast. If you would subscribe to our YouTube channel, all the episodes are on there. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Nearly forgot. I wrote something else there, fashion instead of Facebook. I don't know what I was thinking there. So Spotify, Apple, Anchor, Google Podcasts, etc., etc. Thank you to everyone for tuning in today. I hope you had a lot of fun listening, and I hope you enjoy your Halloween, obviously. Once again, Lisa, thank you so much.
Thank you, Derek.
Thanks, everyone. We will see you next week. Bye.